Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're out here in the garden today at the end of gardening season. As you can see, I still have lots of plants that are alive and thriving. We have not gotten our first frost yet. As I'm filming this, it is the very end of September. I think it'll be partway through October when I post this. I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to post it, but it'll be a little bit later than that when you actually see it. As of the time of filming this, we have not gotten our first frost, but a lot of the plants are definitely on the way out. Garden season is definitely winding down, and I find that that is the perfect time of year to really reflect and look back on the gardening season. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about tomatoes. This is basically going to be 2024, a year in tomatoes. So at the end of each gardening season, I really like to reflect back on specifically tomatoes because I grow so many varieties. I really like to reflect back on which tomatoes did really well throughout the season so that I can start planning next year's garden season. Now, it's a little bit early to start planning the 2025 garden, but I find that it is helpful for me, at least, to reflect back on this past gardening season, basically while it's still fresh in my mind. That's why I am making this video today. We're going to talk a little bit about all the tomatoes that I grew this year. If you've been following along with me for any length of time, it will not be surprising to you to know that I grew a big variety of tomatoes, like I do every year, and as I'm sure I will continue to every year that I am gardening. So this year, like in past years, I primarily focused on growing heirloom tomatoes. You know, heirloom tomatoes, I love them because there's so much variety. They have such amazing flavor. They're so unique. But this year I did want to add in a couple hybrids as well. You know, as amazing as heirloom tomatoes are, the bulk of my garden is heirlooms, and the bulk of my garden probably always will be heirlooms. There are some advantages to growing hybrid tomatoes too. The advantages that I was primarily concerned with are disease resistance, and kind of related to that, a lot of times in my gardening season, so as the season gets going, a lot of my tomatoes tend to succumb to disease or at least be slowed down by disease. Hybrids are a little bit more resistant to that, so my hope is that by adding a few hybrids into the mix, I would be able to extend my gardening season and hopefully increase my overall yield of tomatoes. So I'm going to share with you today the hybrid varieties that I trialed this year and what I thought of them, along with my complete review of all of the cherry tomatoes and the heirloom slicer tomatoes that I grew this year. So buckle up, there's going to be a lot of tomatoes. So we're going to start by talking about cherry tomatoes. Now, growing a big variety of cherry tomatoes is something that is really important to me. So even though I have a few varieties that I really love, I always grow extra varieties besides those. And every year I like to try at least one or two new varieties. I find that having a big variety of cherry tomatoes just adds a lot more excitement to our summer meals. It makes our salads so much more interesting. It provides a big variety of colors and flavors. And one benefit of growing a big variety of varieties, in this case cherry tomatoes, is that sometimes if there's some sort of adverse weather conditions or some sort of growing issue, it tends to affect different varieties differently. So you may find, for example, if you have an extra rainy year like we did this year, you may find that some varieties handle that better than others, which means that makes it extra beneficial to grow multiple varieties. Now, as we go through the different varieties, both with cherry tomatoes and when we get to the large slicer tomatoes, I tried my best throughout the growing season to take video, like little video clips of each variety so that I can show you a little bit about them as I talk about them. I probably don't have that for every single variety that I'm going to mention, but the ones that I do have, I am going to just put a little video clip in here so that you can really see the tomato and get a little bit closer to experiencing that variety yourself. So, as I said, we are going to start with cherry tomatoes. And specifically, we are going to start with my favorite, most reliable go-to cherry tomato variety, and that is Sungold. Now, if you talk to gardeners, if you have experience gardening, if you join any gardening groups, you are going to find over and over again, Sungold cherry tomatoes are going to be recommended. Those are pretty much a universal favorite cherry tomato, and there is a reason for that. They are delicious. They have an amazing complex flavor. They're really sweet, but they have a really nice tanginess too that kind of balances it out. They're really dependable. I find that year after year, Sungold tomatoes always yield well for me. No matter what kind of weather conditions we have, it's really reliable. Now, I did mention I grow primarily heirlooms. Sungold is, I think it's probably the only hybrid cherry tomato variety that I grow, but it is one of the best. So I definitely always make room for it in my garden. It's a beautiful medium-sized golden yellow-orange cherry tomato. I do find that this is the case with most cherry tomatoes, and honestly a lot of tomatoes in general. When you have a prolonged period of heavy rain, especially when that heavy rain is coming after a prolonged dry spell, cherry tomatoes do tend to crack. That's basically because when the amount of water that the plant is taking up suddenly increases, the plant will just absorb so much water and send it into the tomatoes, and they expand faster than the skins can really keep up with, and that causes them to burst. Sungold, I would say, probably has about average crack tolerance. There's kind of pros and cons to crack tolerance. Obviously, you don't want your tomatoes to be cracking, so crack tolerance can be a benefit because it makes your tomatoes more appetizing. It makes them last longer. They have a longer shelf life after being harvested. But the flip side of that is that tomatoes with really tender skins tend to be more prone to cracking. So I find that Sungold is pretty much in the middle of that scale compared to the other tomatoes. So I'm satisfied with the amount of crack resistance that it shows. So another cherry tomato variety on my must-grow list, my family really loves this one, is called the Matt's Wild Cherry. This is a small red cherry tomato. They're really beautiful, really bright, deep red. The tomatoes are on the small side, but the plant yields an abundance of them. They are bigger than some of those really tiny ones. Like if you've ever grown a currant tomato, those are quite a bit smaller than the Matt's Wild Cherry, but the Matt's Wild Cherry is smaller than your average cherry tomato. That being said, it really packs a lot of flavor into a really small space. It has just a really great, just classic tomato flavor, really good. Probably the one negative I would say about the Matt's Wild Cherry is that it does tend to crack a little more easily than I would say probably the average cherry tomato. Another thing, and this is kind of related to the easy cracking, you do have to be careful harvesting them. I mean, if you're going to eat them right away, then don't worry about it. But I do find when I pull them off the plant, sometimes it does tend to tear the skin a little bit. So if you're not planning to eat them right away, you just want to be a little bit careful when harvesting them. So it's not really a negative, it's just something to be aware of when growing and harvesting this tomato. So I would say the third cherry tomato that makes our must-grow list that we make a point to grow every year is the black cherry tomato. This one is really delicious. I will say it has amazing flavor. It's a nice, beautiful, deep purple, smoky color. It's got that really rich tomato flavor that you often find in those really dark colored tomatoes. We really do enjoy it. It's a larger cherry tomato, so I would say it's definitely larger than average. It's larger by far than the Matt's Wild Cherry and larger than the Sungold as well. So that can be a positive or a negative depending on your perspective. We kind of think that just having a lot of variety in, color, flavor, size, it's just all good having a lot of variety like that. I will say I have found that the black cherry is a little bit more inconsistent than some of the other tomato varieties. So the Sungold tomato and the Matt's Wild Cherry both yield reliably for me every single year. Black cherry does reliably yield some tomatoes for me every year, but it isn't always a consistent harvest size. Some years we get a bumper crop and we're just overwhelmed with just the amount of goodness that we get from the black cherry tomato plants. Some years we don't get as many. So it's kind of, it's a little bit hit or miss, but we definitely grow that one every year just because of the beauty and the flavor. The next tomato variety that I want to mention is kind of a spin-off of my favorite Sungold. This one is called the Sungold Select. Now, when I was talking about the Sungold tomato, one of the things that I did mention about this tomato is that it is a hybrid. There are some advantages to growing hybrids, as I mentioned before, but probably the biggest negative, in my opinion, of growing hybrids is that if you save seeds from a hybrid, you don't really know what you're going to get. Now, I could save seeds from my Sungold tomatoes, and I will grow some type of tomato, but it's not going to be reliably the same as the parent plant because the genetics in that plant are not stabilized. So there was a tomato breeder that basically took the time to stabilize the Sungold, and from that the Sungold Select was developed. So that is an open-pollinated variety of the Sungold. I have found it's really comparable to the Sungold in flavor. I don't think it yields quite as much. I'd say the yield is a little bit smaller, but it is a comparable quality tomato. So while I primarily grow Sungold tomatoes, I do like to grow at least one plant of the Sungold Select every year, just because I want to maintain a supply of that seeds, of the Sungold Select seeds, just in case there was ever any kind of seed shortage or crop failure, or for whatever reason I wasn't able to get seeds for my Sungold tomatoes that year. The Sungold Select would make a good replacement. And because I'm growing it myself, it gives me a reliable source of those seeds. So for that reason, I like to grow 1 or 2 plants of that every year alongside my classic Sungold hybrids. The next cherry tomato that I want to mention is called the Rosella cherry tomato. This one has a lot of similarities to the black cherry. The tomatoes are still that really deep smoky purple color. They have some amazing flavor. I would say I think I slightly prefer the flavor of the black cherry. I think it's a little bit more complex. That being said, the Rosella tomato is still really delicious and definitely worth growing. It is also smaller than the black cherry, so that again could be a positive or negative depending on what you're looking for. I like to grow both of them. I find that the Rosella, so I know I mentioned that the black cherry is a little bit more of an inconsistent producer as far as volume. I find that the Rosella, on the years that the black cherry doesn't produce as much, the Rosella produces more. But on the years that the black cherry produces a lot, the Rosella doesn't produce quite as many as the black cherry. So I think I've only grown Rosella a few years, but it's been my experience a few years that I've grown it. It's probably a little bit more consistent than the black cherry, but sort of, in the middle of what you could expect from a poor black cherry year or a really good black cherry year. So it's a really good tomato, and I'm probably going to continue to grow that one every year. Next, I want to mention the red centiflora cherry tomato. This one, I think this was my second year growing this tomato. I've been really pleased with it. It's a classic red cherry tomato, larger than Matt's Wild Cherry. I have found that the flavor's good. I think the flavor of Matt's Wild Cherry is a little bit better, but red centiflora still does have a really delicious tomato flavor. The yield is amazing. It is a multiflora variety, which means that it produces these huge clusters of flowers, and those in turn, assuming they all get pollinated, turns into a huge cluster of cherry tomatoes. So the yield with that one is really good. One negative that I have found with the red centiflora is I think it's a little bit more susceptible to rot than some of my other tomato varieties. That's not going to be an issue every year. But for example, this year in my area, we got a lot of rain, much more rain than we normally get over the summer. And the red centiflora tomatoes started out amazing. We got a great yield, and then with all the rain, it kind of led to a little bit of an increase in disease over what we normally see that early on in the season. And so what I found was that a lot of the tomatoes kind of got soft spots and weren't really usable. Now that the rain has kind of died down, for the last month or so we haven't been having rain every day like we were all summer. And I'm now getting a second flush of tomatoes from the red centiflora, and I anticipate that it's going to keep yielding all the way up till frost, which in my area will probably be about 2 or 3 weeks from now. So we should be getting lots of delicious cherry tomatoes all the way up to frost with that one. So that one is a good, reliable variety as well. Next, I'm going to mention the Berry's Crazy Cherry Tomato. This one, again, is a winner. It's a great cherry tomato. It's a lot different than a lot of the other cherry tomatoes that I grow. So it really, it fills that need for variety that I have. It's a pale yellow. I mentioned the Sungold is more of a deeper golden orange. The Berry's Crazy Cherry is a really pale yellow. The flavor, along with the color, is milder. So I have heard it said that a lot of people that don't really like tomatoes, and especially don't like the strong flavor that you often find with tomatoes, do actually prefer the mild flavor of the Berry's Crazy Cherry. I love tomatoes, and while I do really like the flavor of the Berry's Crazy Cherry, I love that rich tomato flavor that you get from a lot of other varieties. So the mild flavor in and of itself isn't necessarily a positive for me, but because it's variety, it adds some variety along with all the other more richly flavored tomatoes. I find that having some mild tomatoes kind of thrown into the mix really adds some really nice variety. Now this one, it's a little bit different shape as well. It's more of an oval tomato with a little point on the end. I think I do have a video of that one, so I'll make sure to put it up here as long as I do have one. So it's a little bit different looking. Similarly to the red centiflora, the Berry's Crazy Cherry is a multiflora variety as well. So that produces an abundance of really delicious cherry tomatoes. So I do definitely recommend that one, and that's going to stay in, our growing repertoire as well. The final variety that I want to mention for cherry tomatoes is the Hartmans Yellow Gooseberry. This was the very first year that we tried this tomato. I actually got this one in a seed grab bag from M.I. Gardener at the end of last season. This tomato was not on my radar at all, but since I got the free seeds in the grab bag, well, I mean, I guess not free, I mean, I paid for the grab bag, but I got the discounted seeds in the grab bag. I figured I would go ahead and give it a try. And I think I had mixed feelings about this one. The flavor was good. It did, again, fulfill that need for variety because it was really large, even larger than the black cherry. It was definitely a 2 or 3 bite cherry tomato, a lot bigger than a lot of the others. So I found that for most of the ways that I like to use cherry tomatoes, I prefer to cut it in half, and that made it more similarly sized to a lot of other tomatoes. It also was a different color than what I have. You know, I mentioned the Berry's Crazy Cherry was that pale yellow. The Sungold is the, you know, the golden orange yellow color. This one was a true medium yellow. It was really beautiful, a nice bright sunshine yellow, and I did really like it. What I did find was at the beginning of the season, I was thinking that the yield wasn't going to be very good. You know, we did get some tomatoes, they were delicious, and of course the fact that they were larger did kind of make up for the lack of number, but we didn't get that many initially. But then later on in the season, it actually started to pick up, and we are actually still getting tomatoes from that plant now. So while the yield was a little bit of a slower start, I found that it did pick up. I don't think it's one of my favorite cherry tomatoes, so I don't know that I'm necessarily going to grow it every year, but I think I will probably grow one plant of the Hartmans yellow gooseberry next year, mixed in with all my, you know, all my other classic tried and true varieties, and we'll see. Knowing me, I'll probably add some other cherry tomato variety into the mix for next year, so definitely stay tuned for that. I'll keep you posted. So that is the complete list of the cherry tomato varieties that we grew in the 2024 garden. So now I'm going to jump into my slicer tomatoes. So I'm going to start with my heirloom and open-pollinated varieties, and then at the end I will mention a few of the hybrids that I grew this year and tell you basically my decision and the verdict on those varieties. So the first tomato that I want to mention is the Cindy's West Virginia. This is a really large heirloom slicer tomato. I really love this one. This is the second year that I've grown it. It did really well for me this year. It did really well for me last year. It's a big pink tomato. It's very meaty. I found that for the size of the tomato, it had very few seeds in it. And there's just so much meat and flesh to that tomato. And the flavor is really good. It's just, you know, I don't really know how to describe it. It just has a really good, very tomatoey heirloom flavor, and it does well for me. I found that both this year and last year, for the size of the tomatoes, it was actually impressively early. So I think it was probably my first of the really large slicer tomatoes to ripen, and we really enjoyed that, especially early in the season. Next, I want to mention the pink ox heart tomato. This is one that I tried last year for the first time. This is another one that wasn't on my radar at all. I got this one in a grab bag as well. So I decided to give it a try, and I was really impressed with it last year. So it went on my growing list again for this past year. And I think I grew 2 plants of this variety. It yields really well. So I was really impressed with the yield. The tomatoes are really delicious. They're really large. This is another really beautiful pink tomato, another really meaty tomato. I think that the flesh of the ox heart tomato it's a little bit less juicy than some of the other tomatoes, which can definitely be a positive depending on the application you're planning on using it in. I found that it worked really well for salsa. I have not tried making sauce with it, but I would imagine based on the texture of the tomato that it would work really well for sauce too. So overall, I highly recommend pink ox heart tomato. Next, I want to mention the Thorburns Terracotta tomato. This was the very first year that I had grown this tomato. It had been recommended to me with reservations. So I will say this is another one that I had kind of mixed feelings on. So what I had heard growing this tomato was that the flavor is amazing as long as you harvest it at the right amount of ripeness. I heard you want to make sure that it's fully ripe, but you don't want it to be overripe. And it also had a really unique color. I didn't have any other tomatoes in my garden. I've actually never grown any other tomatoes with a similar color to this one. You know, as the name says, it's a terracotta color. It's orange, but it's not the bright golden orange that most orange tomatoes are. It's more of kind of a brownish orange, like a darker, deeper color. And I found that really fun because that is a color that, as I said, I have never grown before. So what I was told by many people, including some of you, was that the flavor is amazing. the yield wasn't that great. And I've got to say, at the beginning of the season, my terracotta tomatoes started putting on so many tomatoes. And I was like, what are you guys talking about saying the yield isn't great? This has so many tomatoes. But what I ended up finding out was that as the season went on, probably the majority of the tomatoes on the plant ended up developing blossom end rot. So while it sent many tomatoes, I didn't actually end up harvesting that many. So you guys were right. The flavor was really good, but the yield wasn't as good. I did find with this tomato too, and as I said, it was an extremely wet summer for us. I found that it was a little bit more prone to rot, not just blossom end rot, but also just regular fruit rot. So there were many tomatoes that were not usable. I think I'll probably give this one another chance just based on the fact that it was such a wet summer. It wasn't really a great trial. I want to see how this tomato will grow in different conditions. That being said, if I find some new varieties that I really want to try, this is going to be one of the first ones that kind of gets bumped off my list. So we'll see what happens. I may grow that one again next year and give it another try. I may hold off for a year and try it again at some point in the future. So we'll see what happens with that one. Next, let's talk about the Azoichka tomato. This tomato is, I will say, it surprised me this year. It surprised me a little bit last year too. Last year was the first year that I grew the Azoichka tomato. I believe it's a Russian heirloom. It's a medium-sized true yellow tomato. It's a bright sunshine yellow. It's not the kind of orange tone that a lot of, yellow tomatoes are. It's a true yellow. And I remember last year feeling like it produced really abundantly, it had good flavor, but the flavor wasn't quite as rich as I would have liked. And that is often the case with yellow tomatoes. A lot of times they tend to be a little milder, a little sweeter, which many people prefer. I usually am the opposite and prefer a richer, deeper tomato flavor. But that being said, this year, my Azoichka tomatoes, I don't know if I was just remembering wrong, or I'm not sure, maybe the flavor was just different this year. They seemed to have a more complex flavor this year, and in addition to producing a lot like they did last year, I actually really enjoyed the flavor this year. So I'm glad that I grew that one again, because I was actually really happy with it. I found that the Azoichka was one that produced more towards the beginning of the season and kind of tapered off. I find in my garden, I really like to have tomatoes with a variety of maturity dates. A lot of those early season tomatoes tend to produce a lot at the beginning, which is great because you've been waiting for those fresh tomatoes, all winter and all spring, and finally you get them. And it's great to have a lot of tomatoes then. But what I find is that a lot of the early yielders tend to kind of taper off as the season goes on, and so I like to have some later maturing tomatoes as well to pick up the slack at that point. So the Azoichka fit the need for the early maturing tomato, so I'll be growing that one again. We did really enjoy it. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the black Brandywine tomato. This is one that I was really excited to try because I do really like black tomatoes. I also really like the classic pink Brandywine tomato, so I figured the black Brandywine would be a combination of the two, and I was really excited to try it. I tried this one last year for the first time and found that it did not produce well at all for me. But last year we had a lot of trouble with black and purple tomatoes in general. I'm not sure why. So my beloved Cherokee Purple that I grow every year is generally really reliable for me, and last year that one did not perform well for me at all. So I kind of figured that the black Brandywine may have fallen prey to whatever it was that was affecting all of the other black and purple tomatoes. I'm not sure why it seemed to be that color that was affected. I'm not sure. There must be something they all have in common. So I decided to give the black Brandywine another try. So this year was its second chance, and it did do better than last year. We did harvest, not a lot, but we did harvest, some tomatoes from the plant. I did find, this one was marketed as being a really large tomato, and I'm sure that it is in the right conditions, but that was not my experience. The tomatoes had good flavor. We did enjoy them, but I found that it produced very small tomatoes. I would say, probably smaller than medium size. I think I have a video of that one here, so I will put it up on the screen if I do. I found that while we did enjoy the flavor, I thought that we could get better yield by planting a different variety instead. So I don't think I'll be growing that one again, at least not next year. Maybe at some point in the future I'll give it another chance, but I think for next year we're going to skip the black Brandywine. And now that brings me to the classic Brandywine. So I did not start any seeds for Brandywine this year. I was not planning on growing that variety. The past couple times I've tried to grow Brandywine, it has not done well for me. You know, I have had it be successful for me in the distant past. Here and there, I have grown it and gotten some really good tomatoes from it. I've actually been pretty impressed. But the last couple years that I've tried it, it has not been successful. This year, I went to a local nursery and kind of on a whim, I saw that they had Brandywine tomato plants. So I picked one up to give it a try. It was a beautiful, healthy seedling. And I grew it, and I can actually see the plant over there. It still has lots of beautiful green growth. But for whatever reason, we haven't harvested a single tomato from the Brandywine this year. So I don't know. Maybe the Brandywine is just not a good match for my area, and the year that I was successful with it, I think I was successful with it probably a couple years. Maybe those were just flukes. I'm not really sure. So I'm not sure if I'll be growing that one again. I'm sure at some point in the future I'll give it another try, but I don't think I'll be growing it again next year. So now I want to talk about one of my new favorite tomatoes, which is the Wisconsin 55. Last year was the first year that I grew this tomato. This is another one that I got in a grab bag. So I love doing those grab bags. This is a little bit of an aside. But a lot of times there'll be plants that are not on my radar at all, and I'll get them in a grab bag, so I'll decide to try them. And I have actually discovered a lot of my favorite varieties that way. So I find, even though I love reading the descriptions and picking out the varieties that I really want to try, I like to do grab bags too, because it kind of forces me to grow something a little bit different than what I would normally pick. So back to the Wisconsin 55. I grew that plant last year. I found that it yielded really well. It really surprised me with how many tomatoes it yielded. They were, smallish slicer tomatoes, probably a medium-sized tomato, but for a slicer tomato, I'd say they were on the small side. They're a true red. They're perfectly round. They kind of look like the tomatoes you'd get at the store, perfect round globe. But obviously the flavor is a lot better than getting a grocery store tomato. So I found that this is kind of similar to the Azoichka, what I said, where it yields really heavily at the beginning of the season. So this is a great tomato to fill that early tomato void. So I found that they yield really well. What I did find with the Wisconsin 55, both last year and this year, is that it kind of tends, at least in my area, to peter out before the season is over. It didn't yield all the way up to frost for me, but since I have other late season tomatoes that kind of fill in the gaps there, I will still be growing the Wisconsin 55 every year. That one's definitely going on my must-grow list. Next, I want to mention the Russian Big Roma tomato. This is a tomato that was not on my radar at all. You're kind of going to sense a little bit of a theme here. At the same nursery where I found that Brandywine seedling, I found a seedling for Russian Big Roma tomato, and it just seemed interesting to me, so I decided to give it a try. So I purchased a seedling and planted it, and I will say one difference between the Russian Big Roma and the classic Roma tomato is that the Russian Big Roma is an indeterminate tomato. So what that means is that rather than setting its entire harvest over a short concentrated period of time, the Russian Big Roma basically spreads its yield throughout the growing season. So a lot of times when people are looking for tomatoes to can, they choose determinate varieties because, in that case it's beneficial to get the whole harvest all at once and, because you need it for a big canning and preservation day. The Russian Big Roma, as I said, is an indeterminate. So if you're looking for a tomato where you want to can lots of products all at once, that may not necessarily be the best choice. But I did really enjoy it. It is significantly larger, as the name suggests. Significantly larger than the classic Roma tomato. So I find that really helpful because, it takes a lot less time to process one large tomato as opposed to 2 or 3 smaller tomatoes. And, it had good flavor. It was, it's definitely meant for use in things like salsas or sauces. It's not necessarily an amazing slicing tomato, but it worked really well. I mostly used it to make fresh salsa as it came in throughout the season, so I found it really useful for that. Next, I want to talk about the Ukrainian purple tomato. This is another tomato that I tried for the very first time this year. This was kind of an impulse buy. I had my tomato varieties for the season chosen, and then, another one just kind of called out to me. You'll find that's a theme with me that tends to happen. So I purchased the Ukrainian purple tomato seeds, and I thought this was a really delicious tomato. I thought it had really rich, delicious flavor. It was kind of, it's a unique purplish pink color. I did really enjoy it. I found the yield was, I think, probably average. I would have preferred a little more yield, but because the flavor was really good, I am definitely going to grow that one again next year. And then after I've grown it for a few seasons, I'll hopefully be able to give you a little more of an idea of you know, just the overall quality of that tomato. But like I said, we did really enjoy it this year, so I'll be growing it again. Next, I also want to talk about the black from Tula tomato. You know, I love those nice dark black tomatoes. I find that they have such a good flavor. I really like them. So black from Tula was kind of a classic black heirloom that I had not tried before. So I decided this was the year and I gave it a try. It initially had a rough start just because honestly, I don't even remember what happened, but something happened I only had one seedling of this variety and something happened to set it back. So I wasn't sure if I was going to get a yield from it, but it did end up catching up. I'll say I probably got an average yield for an heirloom, but they were nice, good-sized black tomatoes. They had a really good flavor. I really enjoyed them. I don't think that this year was probably a real true test because, as I said, it did have some struggles through no fault of its own as the season went on, mostly at the beginning of the season. So I will try it again, but I was happy with it just from the little bit that we got to sample of it this year. So the final heirloom tomato that I want to mention in this video, I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, so please bear with me, is the Sart Roo. This tomato was one that I had never tried before. I'd actually never heard of it before, but I think it was on the cover of Baker Creek's whole seed catalog this year. I think that's how I saw it. It's a beautiful tomato. It's a pale yellow tomato with purple streaks on the shoulders, so it really is beautiful. I did find when I actually grew it, it wasn't even really yellow. I would say it was more of a creamy off-white color. It was really beautiful. I did find that the yield was kind of on the low side. The tomatoes that I did get were beautiful. They were good, probably a little bit, as you probably expect from me. I found that the flavor was probably a little bit on the mild side for my taste. I also found that the fruits were a little bit more prone to rot than some of my other tomato varieties. That being said, I did really enjoy trying it. I don't know that I'm going to grow that one again. I may give it one more try and see what happens. It kind of depends on what calls out to me next year, what I am planning to grow next year, if I have space for that variety or not. So I am definitely glad that I tried it once. We did enjoy it. But I would most likely bump that variety from my list in favor of something that yields a little bit more with a little bit more shelf life than those fruits tend to have. So I did mention that we were also going to talk about some hybrids in this video. So this year I tried out 4 different hybrid varieties in my garden. As I said, my main criteria, I obviously wanted good flavor because if I'm going to grow a tomato myself, I want it to be something that is a lot better than what I can get at the grocery store, and honestly, probably even better than what I'd be able to get at the farmer's market. So I wanted something with good flavor, good yield. My main criteria for growing hybrids, because I already have lots of delicious heirlooms with good flavor and reasonable yield. But the reason I wanted to add hybrids to the list was because in my area, even though I live in Connecticut, which isn't known as being a really hot, humid area, but we do really have fairly humid summers. And I do find that pretty much every year, my tomatoes will succumb to disease at some point in the season. It varies year by year as to when that happens. Sometimes they don't fully succumb, but it does definitely slow down their yield at some point during the season. So hybrids are generally bred and known for being a little bit more disease resistant than most heirlooms. So because of that, I wanted to give some hybrid varieties a try and just see if I'm able to extend my tomato growing season a little bit longer. So I tried out 4 varieties this year and I'm just going to give you my thoughts on each of them. So far and away, we'll start with the winner. Far and away, my favorite of the hybrids that I grew in my garden this year was the Lemon Boy Plus. This was a medium-sized true yellow tomato, perfectly round tomato. We found that it was really delicious. For a yellow tomato, it had a stronger tomato flavor than you often find in yellow tomatoes. I found that it was really good tasting. I found that it yielded really well. So, hybrids are known for disease resistance. They're also known for a little bit higher yield than your typical heirloom. And that was the case with the Lemon Boy Plus. It yielded really well. And throughout the season, we consistently were getting Lemon Boy Plus tomatoes. I still have some on my counter now that I harvested just a day or so ago. And I think there's a couple more out in the plant that aren't quite ripe yet, but I'm hoping that that will be one that gives us a little bit of yield all the way up to frost. So that one I'll definitely be growing again. I was really happy with it. The next variety that I want to mention is the Defiant tomato. This one was recommended to me by a lot of people. I did want to, as I said, the Lemon Boy Plus was a yellow tomato. I did want to have a variety of colors even amongst the hybrid varieties that I was trying out. The Defiant is a classic red tomato. It's on the small side, a little bit smaller than the Lemon Boy Plus. I would say it's probably a small slicer size. I was happy with this one. I will say initially at the beginning of the season, I thought it was going to be a disappointment because it didn't really seem like we were going to get much yield at all from it. But as the season went on, I found that it was actually one of those tomatoes that's a little bit later maturing, which I actually like to include in my garden because, as I mentioned, it kind of fills that void that happens once the early season tomatoes kind of peter out. So I will say the Defiant tomato has yielded well for me. The flavor is fine. It's good. It's better than a tomato you get from the grocery store. Definitely doesn't compare to my heirloom tomatoes, so I wouldn't grow it for flavor alone, but it has held on and lasted longer than a lot of those same heirlooms did. Now the final two hybrid varieties that I want to mention are kind of from the same family. So there's a line of hybrid tomatoes called Chef's Choice, and they come in all kinds of different colors. So this year at a local nursery, I picked up the Chef's Choice Orange and the Chef's Choice Black. I wanted to give both of those a try. Those both had really excellent reviews and we just had great reviews for flavor, disease resistance, yield, all of that. So I wanted to try a couple different colors, so I chose those two. I expected to prefer the Chef's Choice Black, but I actually found out that I preferred the Chef's Choice Orange. Now initially it seemed like Chef's Choice Black was going to have a higher yield than the orange variety, but what I found was, and this kind of surprised me for a hybrid, I've got to say. So as I mentioned when we talked about a couple of the other varieties, certain tomato varieties do seem to be a little bit more prone to the fruits rotting. When I say that, I'm not referring to blossom end rot. I'm talking about the fruits either developing soft spots on the plant so that they're not really usable, or at least part of the tomato isn't usable, or else just having a really short shelf life after being picked. They develop rot spots while sitting on your counter within a day or two. So I did find that the Chef's Choice Black was prone to that. That being said, we were still able to harvest quite a few high quality black tomatoes from that plant. They had good flavor. So the flavor did not compare to a lot of the black tomato heirlooms that I've grown. It was still a lot better than the flavor of a grocery store tomato. So I will say overall this year, I think the hybrids fulfilled the purpose that I was looking for, which was to extend my harvest season and to basically provide a few more tomatoes for me, a little bit higher yield. So it increased my overall yield of tomatoes and extended my harvest season, which is what I was going for. Now back to the Chef's Choice Orange. I found that while it didn't produce quite as many tomatoes as the black variety, I found that the tomatoes were pretty much all, I think, in usable condition. So they were really delicious. Again, the flavor didn't compare to the orange heirlooms that I grow, but it was still a really good flavor. Definitely worth eating and enjoying. And actually, as I'm looking over at my garden now, both the black and the orange varieties of the Chef's Choice have a lot of green tomatoes on them still. So as the season went on and we consistently had a large amount of rain this summer, I found that it really slowed down a lot of my tomatoes throughout the middle of the season. But as I mentioned, the rain has kind of, it's dried up. We haven't had significant rain in the last month, and so a lot of my tomatoes are starting to put on a second flush of fruits. So those tomatoes that I'm looking at now are pretty good sized, and so I'm hopeful that those will ripen before frost, or at least they'll start ripening and we'll be able to finish ripening them in the house. So I think that we will definitely get our money's worth out of those tomato plants. So overall, I was really happy with the variety of tomatoes that we grew this year. I think that that's what I'll continue to do in the future, is to grow primarily heirloom tomatoes, but sprinkle in a few hybrids here and there, just to extend the tomato harvest as much as possible. So I would love to hear from you. What are your favorite tomato varieties? I would love to hear if you have any experience with the varieties that I've mentioned, especially if you have experience with the varieties that I've mentioned that didn't do as well for me. So I would love to hear if your experiences are similar to mine. If they're different, I would love to hear how they were different for you. So go ahead and leave all that information in the comments. I can't wait to hear from you. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.